Hello and welcome to the 64th episode of the Machine Ethics Podcast. This episode we're talking with Andrew McStay, Professor of Digital Life at Bangor University in Wales. We chat about emotional human-machine interface, emotion, face and voice detection, emotion detection and hiring, as well as gaming those systems, interactive AI kids' toys, the space between an ethical subject and an object of an AI system, raising children in an AI world, cultural differences in emotional profiling, and emotional AI regulation. Those long-time listeners might be aware that my voice sounds slightly different this month. That's because I had a spout of COVID, along with several colds after kids went back to school. We're okay now, but I sound like this. If you'd like to find more episodes of the Machine Ethics Podcast, you can go to machine-ethics.net. You can contact us at hello@machine-ethics.net. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at machine_ethics or Machine Ethics Podcast. And if you can support us on patreon.com/machine ethics. Thank you and hope you enjoy.
Hi Andrew, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hi Ben.
If you could please introduce yourself, who you are and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name's Andrew McStay. I'm Professor of Digital Life. I work at Bangor University, which is in North Wales in the UK. I think probably the topic that we're talking about today is the work that I do on emotion and affect.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So the first question we always ask on the podcast is, what is AI?
Oh God. Yeah, so my background, come from kind of the more social, kind of humanities side of things. So yeah, I won't be giving you kind of an in-depth account of kind of programming languages and all things associated with AI. But for me, I think, AI is about it's about autonomous systems, and it's about systems that make judgments. Yes, AI kind of overlaps with machine learning and various kind of systems that do not apply to people. But I think for me, the real kind of interesting part of AI is, again, about autonomous systems, and it's about judgments made about people. Those judgments can be all sorts of things, but certainly from my point of view, I'm interested in judgments made about how emotion is classified, how it's decided, and what the consequences of all of that is.
And I guess that gets on something the question is of it might be obvious or trite to ask, but why would we want to discern emotion in the first place? Why would we want to produce some tool, some maybe AI system, machine learning system, to effectively work out what human emotion is happening, whether it's from maybe a person in front of you or maybe some sort of artifact that we've left behind?
Yeah, so it depends what you mean by we, or who we mean by we. There are lots of different actors, lots of different stakeholders with kind of different interests and different motivations. So, on the we'll begin with kind of the optimistic side of all of this. I think on the optimistic side, there is opportunity for enhanced interaction with devices, with media content, with online gaming, through using affective and emotion means. So in essence, it's kind of it's an HCI, human-computer interaction question, in terms of how can we have better relationships with devices, with objects, and potentially kind of learn something about ourselves in the process. In terms of other motivations, yeah, I'm sure as we'll get on to, there are kind of negative implications of this. So certainly negative from, again, depends on your perspective on this. But yes, the kind of applications for kind of policing, for security, for commercial exploitation, and so on and so forth. So I think in terms of the why question and the we question, yeah, it really depends on your vantage point.
I like the kind of optimistic view that you were starting with, because it kind of gives me this idea of having maybe a kind of exercise assistant who kind of sees when I'm slacking off and maybe is able to kind of pump me up in some way, which is somewhat effective, knowing something about my personality. And like that's the sort of thing that my mind goes to, and maybe it's not pushing me to do something that I don't want to do, but it's kind of like nudging me in a way that maybe is more personal to me, in the hope that I'm doing, it's nudging me in a good direction for, because I've already set this goal and I want to get fitter, or my stress is high, and maybe I want to do things which are going to de-stress me a bit more, and I can have this thing that can help me do that. So that sounds like a really useful way of looking at it. I'm hoping, is that sort of the thing that you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the positive side, again, one, connects with kind of health and kind of mental well-being. So as you say, it could be kind of short-term nudges just to get you over the line. So you don't see if you're a cyclist climbing mountains, just to give you that kind of prompt, just to kind of get you over the top and kind of over onto the descent. But of course, it could be kind of longitudinal tracking in terms of, kind of a personal kind of mental health tracker, which is designed to go primarily kind of stays on our own personal devices, to kind of inform, kind of how you're feeling over time, and kind of parts of the day where, you kind of might have been a little bit more stressed and touchy than potentially you'd even realize, and being able to track those patterns kind of over a period of time. So, yeah, I think, in terms of scope for personal well-being, be it in the short term or the longer term, definitely there's kind of scope for opportunity with these technologies. But yeah, again, as we'll get on to, utmost and due care is required.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's almost easier to talk about those things, which is why I was hoping that, we could put the case forward for like the useful and interesting and more optimistic side, I guess, first in context. Is that kind of, how did you come by this topic in the first place?
That's a good question. So yeah, as we kind of mentioned, I kind of the top of the call. My background is I guess kind of humanities, kind of social sciences, rather than computer science or HCI, human computer interaction. But weirdly, I got into this through an interest in Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, also with a questionable past. But he writes about moods, and he writes about emotions too. And probably for those on the call who are kind of aware of, who have philosophical background, perhaps kind of not so aware of his work on moods. But yeah, in short, I was working on a book about privacy and about philosophy, and how privacy can be understood in non-liberal terms. So when we think about the word privacy, we indexically think about it as kind of a liberal principle in terms of autonomy, freedom, self-determination, and so on. I was really interested in how other philosophical traditions and other systems, what that can tell us about privacy. That led into an investigation into the work of Heidegger. I stumbled across his work on moods. And then at the same time, this would have been around kind of the early 2010s, there were kind of wearables were on the rise. Quantified self was coming out of the Bay Area in San Francisco. And it just kind of seemed a really interesting overlap between this kind of work on phenomenology that Martin Heidegger did, and the kind of overlap between, kind of the Bay Area stuff going on there. So I kind of stumbled out of there, but then I began to focus more on the technology itself and other ways of theorizing and criticizing, all the emotion tech.
Yeah, and I guess that's only become more important, hyper-mediated. It's progressed since then.
It's so interesting. I think it's, the tech itself has been around, well, weirdly, actually, all the way back to the 1880s, and maybe we'll do a historical deep dive in a bit. But I think most on this listening to the podcast will be aware of Rosalind Picard, who arguably is the mother of affective computing, based at MIT. She was kind of one of the first to bridge kind of machine learning, AI, and affect sensing. But I think, a lot of this was still kind of lab-based work. And even in the early 2010s, when I kind of started thinking about the significance of these technologies, I was really wondering whether I'm kind of totally barking up the wrong tree with all of this, and whether these technologies are going to go anywhere, whether it's just kind of startups kind of playing with things coming out of comp sci labs. And was this a thing? And then, fast forward to today, And then, again, as well, maybe we'll get on to, it's Article 1 of the forthcoming AI regulation, the proposed AI regulations, with Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., all having kind of separate labs dedicated to emotion and affect. So, yeah, even within kind of last 10 years, things have changed so quickly, where at one point, back in 2010, is this a thing? Who knows? Now, yeah, it certainly is a thing for good and potentially for bad.
So it's probably a good time. Shall we get on to the bad?
Yeah.
So things like face detection and maybe emotion detection from a video or a face or someone in front of you. There is kind of detecting things from maybe text or voice. So where there is maybe input from a human, there can be presumably this idea of kind of teasing out what is extra data, maybe, which is not necessarily coming along with the normal speech, the normal kind of communication, which is maybe the body movement or the tone or these other things that actually are very nuanced, and that as a human being we kind of through our lives we are always learning, and looking and picking these markers up. So are these the sorts of things that we're talking about here, really? The kind of like, how do we program a machine to do these things? And I guess when you were saying in terms of human machine interface, it's kind of interesting because there's a question of then how do you then surface that information, and how do you categorize that information, which is then going to be useful for anyone, and how that becomes unbiased or maybe surfaced in a way which is not going to misinterpret the information or maybe be bigoted towards a certain group. I'm searching for the right words here. But yeah, I wonder if there is, because it seems like a lot of activity in this area at the moment, and kind of a lot of kickback, a lot of pushback on some specific types. So do you want to start with a kind of the thing that comes to my mind, which is the face detection, the emotion detection, which seems like the obvious starting point for me. Do you think there's a good use of this, and why is it that people have such a problem with it in terms of kind of hiring? I think is the use case.
I mean, it's interesting. What you actually began there was with voice, and I think it was really interesting that you did that, because face-based detection, face-based emotion recognition systems, yeah, certainly they're getting a lot of the attention, a lot of the criticism. But I think in terms of the application that has much more chance of scaling more seriously, I think it is voice. And of course, we all have smartphones. Many of us have home-based voice assistants. And voice is harder to code than faces. We will come on to faces in a moment, but yeah, voice is a lot harder. So Amazon for years have been working on emotion recognition systems in voice. But I think we all understand, those of us who have used an Alexa type system, it doesn't always understand us as it might. So the idea that our mood and emotions and our feelings might be misjudged, it could lead to some really awkward and clearly very annoying interaction. But I think voice will be the one that eventually scales in time. But to return back to the face-based analytics, why is it causing such a stink? I think broadly it's based on an understanding of emotion that is around kind of 50, 60 years old now. So it's based on a very simple taxonomy of facial expressions. And the problem is that judging a person's interior state via a palette of kind of 6 or 7 basic facial emotion expressions is very methodologically problematic. People are much richer, people are much more nuanced, but even the basic premise of inferring an emotional interior state from an expression, what's what psychologists call reverse inference, is innately and inherently problematic. It's a slightly trite example, but we don't always smile when we're happy. We have a variety of means and reasons for why we smile. Sometimes it's just kind of to lubricate kind of social arrangements. Sometimes it's a passive act. Lots and lots of different reasons. And that's just within one regional context alone, such as the UK or North America and other places where, this podcast will be listened to. Try that in Japan, which has very, very different ways, very different kind of systems of emotive, very different behavioral codes. It becomes awfully difficult. So, in terms of kind of these systems are based on universalizing logics of emotion. On these ideas that there is such a universal language of expressions has roots back in Charles Darwin, back in Duchenne, around kind of the 1880s, 1870s. So the idea of kind of building kind of taxonomies of emotion with universal applicability, it has a long, long history. But in short, in conclusion, why these systems are profoundly flawed is because they're based on really faulty methods. I should add that in terms of kind of work that goes on with facial expressions, there are a lot of emotion scientists who work on facial actual coding systems, face-based research, who again would take deep umbrage with their work being synonymous with kind of the work of Paul Ekman, these kind of 6 or 7 basic emotions. So they would argue, well, actually, we have kind of much more nuanced systems that classify 50, 60, 70 facial expressions, and that we do check these when we do our research. We do check these with kind of participants to see whether kind of that the emotional recognition did tally and did correlate with what they were thinking, feeling, and experiencing at that time. So sometimes the criticism that these technologies receive, it's correct, it's right, but I don't think that the way that these technologies are being applied is the end of the story. Basically, all of this has a much kind of longer path ahead.
And I guess it's a question of, where these sorts of systems, even if they are very good or do achieve what they're set out to achieve, is it an appropriate use case? And obviously like hiring and things like that. Is it useful in that context, or is it kind of, does it then undermine something that we don't want to take away from that process? Does it take away from the participant of that process something, because it's no longer, for instance, in that particular kind of situation, it's no longer something that they've signed up for. It's not a usual use case. So you don't go into an interview and go, well, I'm going to talk to a human, and humans, I know something about humans, and humans have a certain way of interpreting people's body language and voice and such. But now I'm going into this new context where maybe I actually have to change my behavior in order to play up to a system which is part of the hiring process. And now it's not the same as before. It's this other, it's not really a hiring interview, it's this hiring interview plus. And do I have to be performative, in this context? How do I need to change my behavior? And it's really interesting to me, about that kind of societal change, but like that individual behavior change. How do we change our behavior because of these technologies?
I agree. There's a lot going on in that question.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. But in terms of the world of work, you can think of it as a funnel. You can think of it from kind of the initial contact between a recruiter and a person who's kind of looking for a job role or post, and that will may involve with kind of companies such as Highview and Pymetrics. It will involve an absence of a human. So it will involve a video call. It will involve video recording, and a person will be judged on the basis of that video call, potentially without a human ever seeing that video. So the screening process can and may start early. And I think, it's kind of worth mentioning that in terms of kind of the scale of who is using these services. Again, it's not just kind of small companies. These are companies such as Unilever, Bank of America, huge firms that, again, are kind of interested in essentially kind of saving labor time on the recruiting and, I guess, to use that slightly techie term, onboarding process. You're kind of at the first stage. You have kind of video-based interviews that kind of recording kind of face, voice, and kind of behavioral modalities. And then in the interview process itself, where a person will be present, but there will be that kind of extra layer of analytics as well, making suggestions about the performance of a candidate. And as you say, kind of in terms of kind of how they emote, how they behave, and what they do. And that does raise questions in terms of basic principles of dignity in relation to autonomous sensing, but also those kind of practical and tactical issues of how a person does perform for a system, whether a person does over enunciate, whether a person does kind of emphasize kind of pauses and tries to kind of build almost kind of more drama into emotion, so as to game sensing systems.
Yeah.
Have
you seen the film? What's that film called? It's about a guy in America who has to put on his white voice to take phone calls, and it strikes me that this is this is what's going to happen. You have to put on your best Queen's English, or you have to put on your best I don't know, whatever the equivalent would be in America, but you'd have to maybe put on, like you were saying, with the enunciation and pauses and things like that, and there's this advice that when you're talking you should pause instead of ums and ahs, because ums and ahs can be interpreted as where you're unable to think quick enough, or you don't have something to say, so you end up doing this kind of special case performance for that interview to game the system.
I mean, there's an interesting question there, isn't there, about, well, what's the difference? So in terms of kind of people from kind of different kind of subcultural groups with kind of different lexicons and kind of modes of behavior, this idea of conforming to a particular stereotype to be that kind of successful candidate, whether it kind of involves autonomous systems or not, that fact remains. And I think, I definitely got to get the idea of having to conform to an ideal type for an autonomous system. I see that. And, typically within kind of a recruitment-based process, that's kind of the system is trailed in relation to who an ideal employee is. It'd be really interesting to go back to kind of each company who's using these systems to find out who their ideal employee is, what their class background is, what their color background is, what their ethnicity is, and so on and so forth. And I think it's possibly kind of fairly predictable what the answer would be there. But I guess, with kind of companies such as HireVue, it's kind of interesting that, in terms of their autonomous systems, they do seem to be working to de-bias the recruitment process. So, for example, if they're kind of going to recruit kind of 10 or 100 people, they do use percentage thresholds that if kind of autonomous systems are recruiting too many white men of middle-aged type, then they'll go back and start again. And I think, in terms of, the kind of recruitment process as it works without autonomous systems, then I'm not always sure these kind of checks and balances are in place. So don't get me wrong, this isn't me advocating for autonomous sensing in the recruitment process, but I think the criticism does require a little bit closer scrutiny. The assessment of the situation requires a little bit more of a detailed analysis, rather than say it's all wrong, ban the whole thing outright. Perhaps kind of see what works and what doesn't work, and what's agreeable and what's kind of socially disagreeable. And I think that's possibly the way forward, both for this issue, but possibly a range of other use cases that we might get into as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's much more nuanced than the blanket reaction can be sometimes. And I guess sometimes it's just about, what these systems actually producing at the end of the day, and how useful that is in that particular use case. I was wondering if we could go back to voice briefly. There's this idea which I think John Havens talks about a lot, which is around about different metrics. So, using the right metrics and finding the metrics which are not necessarily just about money. Money's in there, but we can talk about metrics of happiness and health and all those sorts of things when we're designing these systems. But we can also talk about that, when we're talking about GDP and, these big metrics, right? And there's this kind of idea that, there are happier or less happy countries. And it's almost interesting to me that you could maybe do a poll of a whole, population, just because you listen in to their phone calls. Maybe you have to phone up to vote or something like that once a year. And that gives you a pulse of the nation's general happiness at that point, because you can process all the voice and just pull slight things out of there. This percentage of people sound more worried than average, or this, and you can get this. I like this. I just find it interesting that you can use these kind of emotional tools to maybe kind of leverage something that actually is very, very difficult to make quantifiable at the moment. And that's kind of, what this whole process is. It's like we're making something which is not usually quantifiable in machines.
Yeah. or you could just ask people.
Yeah, you could do that.
I think, in terms, and this kind of goes to a fault line with all of these technologies in terms of kind of passive analysis, where you kind of think, we know better than the people themselves. So let's just kind of passively monitor them, and we'll pull out the verbal cues, and we'll find things that they perhaps couldn't or wouldn't be able to tell us themselves. I kind of err on the side of just asking people, and I think it perhaps kind of, I don't know if your example was kind of a serious one, but certainly in terms of you collecting data about emotion in relation to political preferences. Certainly the work that we do at the Emotional AI Lab, where we kind of routinely do surveys across the UK to kind of gauge kind of how people feel about particular use cases, particular technologies, particular modalities. Every time they're really concerned about the use of data about emotion for politics, to the extent where social media profiling and profiling emotion therein is of greater concern in political context than the use of biometrics, which is something that really surprised us. But any use of data about emotion for political messaging or understanding is definitely a red flag area.
Yeah, I guess I had a more positive kind of. Fair enough. That was a very good response. I could just imagine. I mean, however you get that information, it would be useful, wouldn't it? Regardless, if you just ask people, that would be good too. I feel like I've been told.
Sorry.
So there's this whole other can of worms which we haven't actually touched on yet, which is extremely interesting, and that I think we briefly touched on it in a couple of episodes before in the podcast, and it's around this idea that you, as a human being, we are social, emotional beings, right? So creating things which are able to interpret emotions more easily and react, presumably that's the output, they're going to be better reacting or better use for that for people. What's the idea around kind of attachment and making relationships with AI or AI enabled technologies, dolls or your car or different things? Does your work play into kind of how attachment comes about and how we interact with maybe these kind of more socially apt or adept systems?
It's interesting, there's two parts to that. One, I think we could segment along the lines of kind of children and adults, and I think in questions of technology, data, AI, and so on, I think children are a little kind of too often forgotten in these questions, and I think when it comes to children's relationships with objects, children are incredibly imaginative and able to project, perhaps kind of in ways that adults forget. It's not exactly a scientific observation, but it's kind of it's certainly kind of one as parents that we kind of certainly observe. And toys for a long time, again, hundreds of years, have kind of been built around kind of principles of automata. So the idea of kind of AI-based toys that kind of simulate kind of a life presence, is one that goes hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So but I think in terms of kind of where we go today, with kind of the role with datafication added to the mix, i.e. the ability to kind of store, process, interact, that does raise extra questions, because it's not just a projected thing, it's kind of working in reverse as well, like kind of the child is being interpreted. So there's a profiling issue there. But I think, in terms of the question that you're getting at, which is more about kind of the relationship and the potential for harm therein, certainly there is that there. And I think, again, when it comes to these questions, we always have to look at who is building the technologies, who is building the services. And of course, they are companies, there are corporations, and they have particular values, they have particular outlooks. So take, for example, a doll like Barbie. The Mattel increasingly is equipping toys like Barbie with interactive abilities. At present, they're not great. Children quickly become quite bored of them. But, we're very much kind of at the start of something here, over the last kind of 10, 20 years. So these technologies, these principles of interaction, emotion, and kind of psychological interaction between subjects and objects is not going anywhere. Again, we're at the beginning of something here, not the middle and certainly not the end. So again, we have to look at kind of the values and the goals and the objectives of those who were building these systems. Looking at kind of something like out of Barbie, we know over the course of kind of the history of Barbie that it has been imbued with values. Again, sometimes these kind of have kind of racial kind of implications. They have body image implications. So in terms of kind of the psychology of the object itself, the values imbued within that object and system that sits behind it, they have goals, they have objectives, and we need to be kind of very, very careful in terms of what children interact with. So, I think, so it comes down to the question, kind of the theory of mind. And I think, are children, do they see these as systems as other people? Not really. Are they sure that there isn't some agency, that there isn't something behind that plastic facade? They're not sure about that either. Maybe it's a bit like kind of thinking when you was a kid, you wasn't sure whether, and I'm assuming this is adult listeners on the call rather than child listeners, but you were never totally sure that Father Christmas was real or wasn't real. And you just kind of went with it. And maybe there's kind of something similar there, that in kind of the kind of space between kind of the subject and an object being an inert thing, a subject being something imbued with kind of real life. And I think these kind of systems sit somewhere in between that, certainly from kind of a child's experiential point of view. Where we have done work, I don't know if you want to get into this, do stop me.
No, it's great.
Yeah, so we've done quite a bit of work with parents on this. So we haven't done kind of empirical work with children, but we've done quite a bit of empirical work with parental views. And this kind of partly is about kind of smart kind of interactive objects such as toys, but also safety wearables as well. That kind of track affect, mood, emotion, as well as kind of other measures such as location. And it's really, really interesting talking to parents about this, because I think, one, they're a lot more clued up than one would expect. And, we did a UK national survey of around kind of 2,000-3,000 parents, so pretty robust sample, but we also did focus group work as well to really kind of investigate some of the implications of what we were finding. And parents certainly have kind of real privacy concerns with these technologies, and they do have concerns about the nature of interaction that a child would have with kind of synthetic subjects, for want of a better expression. Um, but but they are quite forward facing is the wrong expression. But, they do see that the world that we live in is a very kind of technological environment. And, they do want kind of their children to interact with objects in good and ethical ways. But it's not a case of kind of pulling back from technology. It's about better relationships with technology. And it was quite surprising that, yeah, few parents kind of said, no, keep my children away from kind of all digital objects. Much rather, it was about terms of negotiation and interaction and ensuring that good, suitable safeguards and, of course, regulations are in place rather than kind of leaving it to companies to govern themselves. Parents certainly didn't like that idea.
Yeah. And it kind of brings me back to the behaviour thing again, where there was this news article where they were finding children who were exposed to things like Alexa were using polite language less because, it wasn't a requirement of the system that you ask it nicely. So, Alexa, play the song I like, whatever. And we start dropping pleases and thank yous and things like that. And the idea that you then have to build that in to the system, or you take a responsible view of, what's the effect of this system on a whole generation of people, essentially. And is that the situation we actually want to build? Is quite difficult to discern, but it's the sort of thinking that needs to occur, and it seems like you're kind of looking in that space and seeing what's available. What can we do? What can't we do? What buttons can we push?
It's a really interesting question. I'll have to go back and listen to the conversation you had with Joanna Bryson on this. From Joanna's point of view, her view is that, in terms of kind of AI, these kind of synthetic personalities, she kind of uses the language of slaves. I don't think she's kind of referring to kind of race and historical abuse, but rather that, these kind of systems are objects. They're not subjects. So in terms of the idea of being polite and treating them with kind of as if they kind of had subjectivity, I'm guessing that she was very much against that point of view. I got to see the other way. Someone like Kate Darling, for example, I think she's based at MIT. She would take a very different view, and she would possibly use kind of language of kind of quasi objects, where it's kind of neither object nor subject, and possibly closer to a pet than a human. But so sitting somewhere between. So and of course, in terms of how we want to raise our children to kind of what they learn from objects and possibly take into the classroom and take into kind of interactions with humans. It does raise kind of all sorts of issues. And I guess we'll see whether this is, in the fullness of time, whether this is something of kind of real importance to raising children or not. I suspect not. But we'll see, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it might come down to that distinction you were talking about. What is this distinction of the system here? I have this kind of idea, which I think I voiced in one of the conversations I've had on the podcast, around your personal assistant being personal to you and travels with you ubiquitously through the systems, the fabric of the technology that we have around us. So you can imagine you have something speaking from your phone, but you step into a car and now it's part of the car, or you step out and you start watching a screen and it's helping you on the screen. It just travels kind of with you. And when you get to that point where you have a system which is part of the kind of the fabric of your life, I guess a kind of mobile phone is already sort of that device, but which also is able to kind of socially interact with you, I guess, on a more, just because it has the ability to take more of that input that you give it. And I think we talked about this briefly with Bertram Marley on one of the episodes. I feel like I've hit a brick wall of what I was thinking about.
Yeah, my instant go-to there is Spike Jonze's film Her. With that has kind of the personality Samantha. But of course, these ideas of kind of AI kind of personalities, they kind of sit behind things, kind of such as Siri, Alexa, and so on and so forth. So the idea of kind of kind of cloud-based personality that kind of moves and travels with us, I think it's an idea that's been around for some time. And inevitably with these conversations, you can never really kind of bet against the future. 100 years, who knows? But I think these ideas have been kind of kicking around. Very, very popular. I think for the last kind of 10, 15 years. At present, I don't see any personality or any synthetic agent that I have any chance of having any meaningful interaction with. So I think you can future gaze, 50, 100 and beyond years. But I think as it stands today, it's not an idea or kind of a principle that I kind of entertain too seriously. I think, perhaps the kind of better way of putting it is that, of all the kind of possible outcomes and eventualities and issues that we might want to look at, I think we've got ones kind of a little bit kind of close to home, closer to kind of everyday life that need to be attended to.
Awesome. So I've kind of run out of questions. Is there, or like things I've written down anyway, are there some things that we haven't talked about which you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I should have made a list myself here. I think, in terms of kind of the international dimension of questions of emotion, I think sometimes that's missed. So, particularly if you kind of spend any time on Twitter, you're kind of tapping into some of the discussion around emotion. It's very much kind of a Europe-US thing. And it's so interesting to look at other regions around the world. I'm learning a lot from the project that we're doing with universities in Japan in terms of kind of how emotion sense and affect systems work out there in relation to different behavioral cues, gestures, but even kind of the idea of what a basic set of emotions are. So, in kind of UK, Europe, and US, we kind of look at happiness, joy, anger, disgust, all these kind of things. In Japan, one of the basic emotions that accompanies their list is sorrow. And I just, I find that such kind of an interesting idea that in terms of, not just in terms of kind of formal profiling of people and what they do, but just looking at it from the other side, just the experience of emotional life itself, it's so radically different around the world. So the idea that you can have kind of a set of kind of cloud platforms, Amazon, Google, Facebook, having a universalizing presence in every region around the world, when the experience of kind of emotion subjectivity is so wildly different around the world. It's the premise of kind of emotional AI is very, very, very problematic. I guess as well, we haven't talked about kind of the regulatory context, and maybe that's a conversation for another time. But certainly, it's in GDPR, that big European beast of regulation and legislation, emotions didn't really factor. I think they were in kind of one of the recitals, but they weren't in any of the articles. With the proposed EU AI regulations, emotion profiling is in Article 1. It's slap bang at the top. It is kind of discussed in terms of kind of risky and kind of high risk activities, particularly in relation to work, educational technologies and children's toys. So, I think in terms of kind of these topics and these issues becoming mainstream, it's happening a lot quicker than I expected it to. When I began looking at this 10 years ago to where we are now, to it being kind of slap bang in Article 1, the proposed AI regs, that was a real surprise.
And do you think that's, is that something that you would have wanted to see from that regulation? I
probably want to see a little bit more. I think, it's, the regulations, likely 5 years to go until it's kind of fully completed, fully done. I think there's going to be a lot of changes in relation to the emotion side of this. Some of the language just isn't great. It isn't right. I think there's going to be a lot of jostling around of use cases, and I think basically finer analysis of what emotional AI is and what emotion profiling actually is required. Yeah, I just choose my language carefully here, but yeah, I think a little bit more expertise on the emotion side of things, I think, will be very helpful to kind of those drafting this legislation. But it's hard. I do work with IEEE. That's kind of building standards in this area, or trying to build standards. And as soon as you scratch the surface with kind of how to regulate, how to build standards, what's good, what's not good, what seems kind of really vanilla in one issue, such as gaming, for example, quickly can raise kind of all sorts of kind of issues. Just to give you just one example, you might have an application for home video games. So it's home-based entertainment. What's the problem? But in terms of kind of machine learning that's done on expressions, potentially of children, certainly adults, those algorithms will be deployed elsewhere in other contexts, potentially harmful contexts. So again, quickly you kind of raise kind of problems in terms of what the actual thing is that you're trying to regulate and sort. So yeah, there's going to be a lot. The AI reg's got a long way to go yet, but it's a good start, and I'm glad to see it in there.
Great. The last question we ask on the podcast, Andrew, is what is it that scares you about this AI technologies mediated into society, and what really excites you?
Yeah, so in terms of the scary stuff, the dystopian stuff, actually, no, not dystopian. No, dystopian kind of gives the sense of something that won't come to pass. No, I think actually what we have is coming to pass. And it's about ubiquitous autonomous systems that judge emotion and get things wrong. So we talked about kind of the world of work. We talked about kind of how kind of emotion systems can prescribe it. Yeah, basically it's the ubiquitous nature of this that I kind of is the scale. And I think that's, you wanted a simple answer to a simple question. It's the potential scale of all of this. I think that kind of actually quite neatly leads me to kind of the kind of more positive side, what excites me with all of this. I think enhanced interaction between objects and subjects, between people and technologies, it's something that has an inevitable characteristic, and it doesn't have to be bad. It can be good. The way that this works is through allowing people greater control over systems, trying to do everything as local as possible and allowing maximum control through simple means. I think, it's about enhanced interaction, more meaningful interaction, which can generate pleasure, it can generate joy, it can generate self-learning. There is scope for positivity with all of this.
Have you got any examples of that? It sounds quite abstract at the moment.
It does, and unfortunately, it is pretty abstract. But what I have in mind is systems where we can label our own experiences. So rather than having a system which just kind of tags on one of 6 emotions, to kind of a kind of mood, emotion, whatever it might be. The idea that we just kind of we can have a greater interaction with our technologies, again, by being a bit more active in terms of how we kind of label, annotate, make sense of those kind of patterns over periods of time. I think a more bottom up approach to these technologies is the one that's going to win out in the long term. That's certainly kind of the vision and kind of the idea that I have for these technologies. I think the idea of kind of universalizing logics is one that hopefully we will get past to something that is more inductive, more local, more ethnocentric, more respectful, and one where kind of users can input and annotate themselves.
Great. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and the listeners. If people want to find out about you, contact you, listen to you, how do they do that?
Yeah, so, thanks, Ben. It's been a real pleasure. In terms of kind of contact, have a look on the Emotional AI website. So it's emotionalai.org. Contact details are there. Twitter, I'm at DigiAd. Also have the Emotional AI Twitter pages as well. But yeah, if you're interested, do reach out and do get in touch.
Sweet, thank you. I feel like my mind is still kind of processing everything we've talked about, so it's giving me a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll speak to you next time.
Super, Ben. Thanks.
Welcome to the end of the podcast. Thanks again to Andrew for spending his time with us. Please do check out his work, and if you'd like to listen to more episodes in this vein, then go to episode 30 with Julia Mossbridge, and also episode 37, Social Robots with Bertram Marley. I think it was great and really funny that Andrew wouldn't take some face value stuff from me and push back maybe when I was being more devil advocate. However, I do feel like maybe his answers were quite diplomatic, and maybe I could have pushed a little bit harder how emotional AI will affect us all in the future. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts and help support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/machine ethics. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.